Hey, what's going on, nerds? Welcome back. This is No Demos, episode 5, part 2 of our series on the DOD 250 Overdrive Preamp. It's been a few weeks since we did part 1. Hopefully you've watched that. If you haven't, you know what? You do you. You don't have to. It would make this video make more sense. It would show how dedicated you are to the awesomeness of guitar pedal collecting and nerding. But you don't have to. You can, live your life however you'd like. But if you would want to and you haven't yet, I do recommend to go watch that. Like I said, it will make everything that I'm about to talk about make a whole lot more sense. So if you did watch the video, we started at the beginning of the company in 1974 and we ended where this pedal came out, which is the end of 1977, I believe. And so today I want to basically start here. We might backtrack a little bit and then go on from here to the end of the gray era of DOD 250 Overdrive Preamps. So this is where things get crazy. This is where things get really weird with the company. This era of 1977 DOD, there was a lot going on. There's a lot that doesn't really make any sense. There's a lot of things that seem to just be kind of done because why not? And with really out any regard to further generations and the future nerds like us who will be looking into things like this. But that's okay. We'll get into all of that right now. So like I was saying on the last video, the fall of 1977 was the first release of this series of pedals. And we will refer back to our awesome musician magazine here with this ad showing what I believe are the first two pedals to be released in that sand-casted series. And there's at least one other one that I've been able to find a picture of. The big things to look out for on these is none of them have a power jack. They all use this, what I call the 3D logo. Get a little bit closer there. So they all use that logo there. And they're all slightly different than what came afterwards, graphic-wise. They do have a bit of a lag over from the Bud Box series, meaning in the Bud Box series and the Big Box series, that was the logo that had not changed. And they were all kind of haphazardly placed, meaning like this placement is different than this placement is different than the placement of the other pedal that had come out. So that leads us up to this coming out next. Now I ended that video saying that when you see this, the first thing you might notice is that while it does not have the 9-volt jack, it does have what we call the block logo, which is this right here. So this would be what they came out with initially right after those first ones. Now, the reason this video took me a little bit longer to make than I had hoped and anticipated for is because I was waiting to get this pedal and I got it and it came in and here it is. So this would be what I believe to be the first DOD 280 to use the sand-casted enclosure. There is a Bud Box version. We have a picture of it, so we know that that does exist, and that's exciting. I've never seen a picture of, and I have never seen in real life, a version of this that has the 3D logo. So what happened there? Why are these pedals seemingly from the same time period-ish of those 3D logo pedals? Why were they not included in that initial ad? And I have some guesses. I think the guess for this one is a little bit different than the guess for this one. I think that with this pedal here, the big clue is actually the one Bud Box version that we have seen that we know to exist. If we look at the inside of this, right, we can infer some things from the actual components here. I'm going to get my special pen here so we can point things out. So we can look at some dates on components, right? So here, this chip was made in 1977. The other thing, it's kind of hard to see here, but you can kind of see down there, that component was also made in 1977. Now here's the thing, is the Bud Box version of this pedal has the same exact component with the same exact date printed on it. So my guess is that these were made very close to each other, and that also shows that the Budbox versions were being made in 1977. So there's a few other things that are similar between these two that we'll talk about here in a second. But what I think happened is that when they first came out with the sand casted enclosures, my guess, I'm just spitballing here. My guess is that they had leftover stock from the Budbox era of these that they wanted to sell through before they decided to go ahead and make these. I also think that it was a fairly quick idea to change the logo. Now, at the very end of the last video, I introduced this oddity right here. So we do see a 3D logo, right? So we would think, oh, well, this was probably first. This came before that. But guess what we see? We see a power jack on the side. And I know that that looks like, oh, maybe somebody just added that later. But I've seen, I think, 4 or 5 examples with this same logo, and they all have the power jack, meaning this was done on purpose. The other thing to note is the inside of this pedal compared to the inside of this pedal. Now, this happens to be the same as this. Okay, so on the left, we have the 3D logo with the 9-volt jack here. And on the right, we have the block logo version, which I believe came out first before this. So the question is, why does this have the 3D logo and why does this not have it? Now, to look at that, like I said, here's the compressor that's from the same era as this. There's also a compressor I've been able to find a few pictures, the different versions of, or different examples of the 280 compressor that does the same transition, where you essentially have the same logo and it doesn't label that there's a 9-volt jack here, but it has one inserted exactly like this one does. But what's interesting is this has the block logo with the 9-volt jack, where, like I said, this has the 3D logo. Here's my guess. In one of the interviews with David from DOD, he briefly mentions that if you ever have one of the early DOD pedals and the silk screening was done poorly, that he was probably the one who did it. That he was not very good at it. They didn't come out very good. He was generally unhappy with it. And if we flip this pedal over, one interesting thing, and you actually see this throughout, I think even into the 80s versions of the pedals, some of them use this textured crinkle paint on them as opposed to this smooth paint. And there's not really any rhyme or reason, but what I do know is that every example of the early ones that have the 3D logo, they all use this paint. The other thing I notice is that in the other pedals that I've been able to find with the 3D logo is that the logo itself is much larger on those pedals. So in this pedal, if we look close, I mean, there's some bleeding in there. It's smudged. It looks kind of crappy. And to be honest, you can actually see along the edges where the yellow just didn't come out thick enough, and you can actually see the gray kind of bleeding through. So here's my guess. My guess is that they printed X amount of these, let's say a couple hundred, with this case. And they dried and they looked at them and thought, those look terrible. We can't put these out. Let's just put them aside. So instead, what they did is that they got the smooth paint for the second edition, which we see on the compressor over there. Bring that back over. And they changed the logo. So they changed it to the block logo. So I honestly think that this is the reason they went from the 3D to the block, because it would show up better on the actual pedals. So my guess is they actually printed these enclosures. These were supposed to come out with that very first run of the sand-casted pedals, which means that we probably would have seen it in that ad with the phaser and the FET preamp. This probably would have come out with that, but they were unhappy with how this looked. So instead, they took a little extra time, and maybe a couple months later, these were ready. and they threw in the circuit, and boom, it was ready to go. So that is why I think these and these look the way that they do. This one because they had leftover from the bud box era, and this one because these enclosures looked kind of crappy. So that begs the question then, why did they use them at all? I think that they knew that they were going to be doing this 9-volt jack. And I think that maybe they were in a bit of a redesign period. So if we're going by dates, right? We have this late 77. This would be early spring 78. And I know that by if I look at the pot codes on the inside of here, this would be spring-ish of 78. And then I have this. This is what everybody's used to seeing. So if we hold these up next to each other, I mean, in addition to the 3D logo, the two earliest versions, it's on the left, whereas here it's on the right, and it's actually a little smaller than even what you see there. Or maybe it's the same size, but they have it set up a little differently, right? So this one here and this one here are just a few months apart. This is actually 79. Now, I haven't dug into these too much. If I just go by serial numbers, there's a little bit of a difference, but I don't know date-wise when the first of this kind of right-aligned version comes out. I don't know if it is 78 or if it's early 79. My guess is probably 78, and I say that only because so few of these exist that we've been able to find. So all of that to say, I think they had these left over, and I think they were like, you know what, let's just use them. What the hell, we're already selling these, people are into them, let's just use these for the new 9-volt jack version until we redesign it completely, which is obviously what they ended up doing here. I mean, even the screen itself was totally changed. So now they put a label for the power jack, right? This has a little space here. The gain is part of the outline around the edge, whereas here it's under it. You have the in here. I mean, you see how they changed it. This is also, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is also like a more subdued version of that crinkle paint. So again, they use this type of paint kind of throughout, but it did hold the text quite a bit better. So that's my guess as to what we see here and why we see the transition from these to these. So I don't believe that they made a 250 in that very initial run that would have came out, let's say end of spring, beginning of the fall of 77. I think these came out around winter of 70, and like end of 77, and then toward the beginning of 78 is when I think these two were released. And then quickly they transitioned into this version. Now, here's some other craziness. This is this is where things start to get really wild. If we flip this over and we flip, let's see, this over and this over. First of all, I'm going to point out, well, I'll point out this first. All right. So now we're back. We have the 3D version here, which is the slightly later version, and we have the first version here, which is a little earlier. If we look at the circuit itself, I want you to notice this here, this capacitor, and I want you to notice here, it has two open slots where it does not exist, but it looks like it was supposed to. Also, if we look down at this pedal, it's being kind of covered up, but we have a capacitor here. If we look over here, we have the holes for it, but it's not there. So what's going on here? This is where I'm going to talk about stuff I don't totally understand. So what I've been told is that this little capacitor here, what it did is that it was actually a little bit of a low pass filter coming into the pedal itself, meaning the input from the guitar, it cut off some of the high end going into the effect. And on this version, they did away with it. So it does not exist here, it does exist here. This is actually, from what I understand, left over from the big box 650. where they had this in the circuit. It actually uses the same type of clipping diodes as well. So these are silicon, these are both silicon, but they used this type in the last version of the big box 650. But the circuit is actually the same. It's kind of hard to see here. I know it's been talked about before, but printed on this circuit, and it's backwards, but it says 650. So it's the same with this, and it's the same for all gray versions. They all have that. They all use the same PCB. So then what's this, and why does it not exist here? From what I understand, this cap right here helps regulate the power to the chip itself, which is not something you necessarily need to do if you're just running off of battery. But if you have a power jack coming in, this essentially helps protect the chip itself, or some version of that. Yeah, I'm sure you could correct me in the comments. But essentially, this is not needed in this pedal because it only runs off of a battery, which is why it's not there. But what's interesting is that it has the space for it, meaning that when David was designing this PCB, he knew that they were going to be doing a 9-volt jack at some point, and it was very shortly afterwards. If you look at the number of pedals, serial number, this one that I have that we show on the main screen, this one is the 1001, and this one here, let's see, where do I have it? So that's this. So this is 420. So literally 419 later, they were making this pedal. So it was a very short notice. I think that was the plan all along. And really, to confirm that, and why I was excited to get that 280 in, is if we bring that over here. So here's the 280 compressor, and look what we see right here. We see the same two open holes right there that we see here. And if you look at the very next version, guess what's there? It's the same capacitor that you would see there that does the same exact thing. So it was basically, they had designed a new circuit board for these pedals, knowing that they were going to be doing a 9-volt jack. Why they didn't do it initially, who knows? Maybe they hadn't ordered them yet. Maybe they hadn't come in. Maybe they're just kind of rushing to get everything out. And so they thought, well, let's just put them out now. We can always modify it later. And it was really a simple modification at first, because, I mean, other than this pedal having the 3D logo, it's the same screen that they would have used to make the print on there, right? So all they had to do was drill a hole in the side and then add that in and add the cap in. So that's kind of an interesting thing, explains a little bit. But let's dive back into those serial numbers. So like I said, this one's 1001. This one is 1083. So 82. This comes 82 after this one. And then this one's 1004.20, right? But here's what's interesting. And hopefully I still have you guys here. This one's really for like the true nerds that care about this stuff. What's really interesting is that I have found 250 Overdrive preamps from 1980 that have serial stickers that are in the 500s, meaning 500 earlier than the earliest one I found. But they were not made until 1980. So what the hell is going on here? There's a lot of interesting things that happen with DOD when it comes to serial numbers, when it comes to pedal number designations and things like that. If we go back a little bit further to the big box era, there is I think the equalizer. If you look at the circuit board on there, printed on it is actually the number designation for the phaser. That doesn't really make any sense, but there it is. I think we find a similar thing happen with maybe one of the early compressors. I can't remember, but they're kind of all over the place. When it comes to the serial numbers, here's my guess. I have a feeling that when they decided to jump over from just making everything, regardless of what pedal it was, one after the next, and they started designating them as 250, and then the number of pedal it was. My guess is they printed out, let's say, a couple thousand of these stickers with the numbers in a row. And they probably just had stacks of them. And they could pick from a stack, or maybe they had sheets, right? And they printed out a bunch of these sheets, and on these sheets they had, let's say 20 to 40 individual stickers, and they all had numbers printed on them. Well, if you pull out a stack and just start ripping off numbers, those numbers will be in succession only for as long as that stack is tall. Meaning that if you were to pull out stack 1000 to 1500, let's say, and start numbering from there, as opposed to stack 500 to 1000, then your pedals would be out of order, right? Eventually you would get to the end of 1500, and now you would have this old stack lying around. So I think it also explains when you get over to this version, right? I don't know how many of these were made. I don't think the serial numbers give a good indication, because the serial number on this one would mean this is the 4,394th 250 ever made. I've actually seen these go all the way up to 9,000. Now, are these rare? Not really, but they're rare enough that I can't picture 10,000 grade 250s being made. That to me is excessive. It doesn't it doesn't really make total sense. I mean, I guess it's possible, but what makes more sense is that they had printed out tons and tons of these stickers with numbers on them out of a computer, and were just pulling the stacks down and just slapping them on. Which is why when we get to a pedal that came a year after this one, but has serial numbers 500 before this one, I think that's what we're seeing there. So in a way, the serial numbers give us an indication. Like, I honestly believe that this pedal here came just 80 before this one. And I honestly believe that this pedal here came about 400 before this one. That does make sense. And if we look at the serial number on the compressor, which is this right here. Nope, it's this right here, right? 280, 11, 17. So if we look at this number here, and if we look at the known example of the Budbox version, this is slightly after it, which makes sense. But again, if that Budbox has a 1100 number on it, and we've only ever seen one, it really doesn't make any sense that they would have made 1,000 of those. I can't see that being a possibility. Where did they all go? Why have we never seen them? How does that make any sense? Again, I think it's the way that they were doing the serial numbers and printing them out and just kind of pulling from stacks and slapping them on as they went. So that's my kind of a long-winded, possibly ridiculous theory on what is going on with all this stuff. Sound-wise, they're all fairly similar. To say that they're completely different would be a lie. But to say that they're all the same is also a lie. So obviously there is things like slightly different components being used, whether it's different capacitors, different resistors. Even if the values are changed, changing the type can have an effect on the sound. And it's not supposed to, but it can. And apparently it does. There's also what they call drift, where the values of the individual components can change over time just from being old and being used and being cheap and crappy. And so that can also add to the sound. There's actually, even though these pedals, these two were made just a few apart from each other, they sound different. This one sounds really dark. It's not quite as gainy. It sounds really, really nice, a little more gritty. This one, though, is the best I've ever heard in my life. It's much more open, much more aggressive, goes into fuzz territory. This is the best sounding one. This would be right after it. This one's very close. And now we know this one has that input capacitor that reduces the incoming high-end signal, right? This one does not. So there should be theoretically a bigger difference between the two, but there isn't. They sound very close to each other. This one just sounds a little bit better to my ears. This one here, until I got these two, This was my favorite sounding 250 I've ever had. I have had other ones in the past and ended up selling them off, kind of moving them on. This one sounds amazing, but it sounds different from these two. This one has kind of a boomier low end. This one doesn't have as much mid-range. It's a little more scooped. Still fairly aggressive. Has a little sizzle on the high end, but it doesn't get nearly as fuzz or distortion area territory as these two here. And again, we know that like just flipping them over and looking on the inside, again, you can see, even though it's the same layout, theoretically, the components are different. It's the same 741 chip, but it's also not, right? It's a different company made each of these chips. We have different capacitors here, even though the same value. Again, we have drift. All kinds of things can account for that. So, I know it's been said before, there's not technically a gray spec 250. What they did do, though, is that when they moved over to the yellow version, they actually did redesign the PCB. So that does look different. And there is there's different amount of components. I don't understand the technical aspect of it, so I don't know if they added this back in. I have no idea. I know that there's, I think, one extra resistor and one extra capacitor on the yellow version, and it's a different layout in the PCB. They did actually change that. Not that that changes the sound, but it is different. So that does about wrap it up. But just to recap quickly of the unknowns, the big reason why I wanted to do this video, the things that we would like to really figure out. Number one, when did this come out? Like I said, I think it was December of 77 if I look at all of my context clues, but I don't know for sure. That's just a guess based on everything else I've seen, based on that ad, based on the component pot codes and things like that. When did that come out? When did this version come out? Is my theory correct on why they made this version? Why they made this version? Why they changed the logo? Is this something as simple as poor printing quality? It's a possibility, but it's unknown as of now, and I would like to know it. The other question, if we go back a little bit further, when exactly did the 650s come out? Right? When did they stop making the 650s? Did they stop making the 650s when they finally got the idea to make these? I don't know. And then the big mystery is, did they make a Budbox 250 Overdrive Preamp? We have no idea. I still have not seen one. My personal guess is no. And I'm just going off of, like I said, the couple of ads that I've seen that have not included it in their lineup. But it's possible. And like I was saying in the last video, it could be something as simple as a bad set of components where they made a handful of them but decided not to actually put them out or release them to anybody. And so a few have snuck out and people have seen them, and maybe somebody's in possession of one of them. I don't know. So that's it. Everything else after this, from about 1979 on, we know, and we can go deep into, and the internet has pretty much all the information we would need. On that note, and I didn't say this in the last video, but if you have not watched the JHS video on the history of the Overdrive Preamp, definitely watch that. I'm sure you have. If you're watching this, you've probably watched that. But in case you haven't, it's even a good refresher if you haven't watched it in a while, because he talks about essentially the beginning of the company on to today. He actually, Josh, was very gracious and sent me over his interviews with David and John from DOD, which is where I did get a lot of the information that I used to put this together. So he was a big help in that. So big thank you to Josh. And big thank you to anybody else who has ever posted photos or posted information or did this digging long before I did. I appreciate you, and I hope this helps in sussing out any more and getting down to the true history of one of the greatest pedals ever made, the DOD 250 Overdrive Preamp. All right, this has been No Demos, Episode 5, Part 2, Ed signing off. See you on the next one. Peace.